The arena of blood Rome does not weep for its gladiators. The crowd roars. 50,000 voices shake the wooden scaffolding of the amphitheater. A man stands in the sand, chest heaving, sword arm trembling. Blood runs from a gash above his eye. His opponent lies face down in the dirt, not moving. The victor raises his weapon to the sky. The emperor watches from his box, expression unreadable. This moment will be forgotten by morning. The man's name is Marcus Nonius Macrinus. The year is approximately 165 AD. He has just killed his third opponent in 2 days. The sand beneath his feet is dark with blood that will never completely wash away. In 6 hours, he will be led through corridors beneath the arena, past cells where men wait their turn to die. He will be given wine and bread. His wounds will be cleaned by a surgeon who learned his trade on battlefields. He will survive this day, but survival in the arena is not freedom. It is merely postponement. The historical record preserves fragments of his existence. We know he fought. We know he won. We know the Emperor Marcus Aurelius honored him, gave him gifts, possibly freed him. But between those documented moments lies an ocean of blood and screaming that no ancient writer bothered to record. The deaths of gladiators were too common to warrant detailed description. They died the way cattle died in the stockyards. Efficiently, necessarily, without ceremony. The man Hollywood would later reimagine as Maximus Decimus Meridius never existed. But Marcus Nonius Macrinus did. And his story is darker than any fiction because it is real. This is not a tale of heroic rebellion. There was no escape, no vengeance against a corrupt emperor, no tearful reunion with lost family. There was only the arena and the men who entered it and the empire that fed them into its gaping mouth, day after day, year after year, until the bodies stacked so high that even Rome could no longer ignore what it had become. We begin at the end, because that is where all gladiators began. They were dead men the moment they took the oath. The lanista, the trainer who owned them, made this clear. When a new gladiator arrived at the ludus, the training school, he was shown the graveyard first, not as a warning, as a promise. Rome in the 2nd century AD was an empire eating itself. The borders held barely. Germanic tribes pressed from the north. Parthians threatened the east. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, spent more time in military camps than in his palace. He wrote his meditations while watching men die on frozen battlefields. He contemplated the nature of virtue while approving the torture of prisoners. He was considered one of the good emperors. This tells you everything you need to know about Rome. The gladiatorial games existed before Marcus Aurelius. They would continue after him. But his reign marked a particular kind of horror because it revealed how even wisdom and learning could coexist with systematic brutality. The emperor, who wrote about the importance of compassion, also expanded the games. Under his rule, the arenas filled with more blood than they had in decades. This was not hypocrisy. It was logic, Roman logic. The games were not entertainment in the way we understand it. They were religious obligation, political necessity, and social control bound together in ritual violence. When a wealthy patron sponsored games, he was not simply throwing a party. He was fulfilling his duty to the gods, to the dead, to the city itself. The blood in the arena fed the spirits of ancestors. It satisfied Mars, the god of war. It reminded the population who held the power of life and death. Most importantly, it channeled violence outward, away from the streets and the Senate. Rome ran on violence the way other empires ran on trade or agriculture. Violence was its currency, its religion, its entertainment, and its justice system. The arena was where all these functions converged. When you walked through the gates of the amphitheater, you were entering the beating heart of Roman civilization. Everything that made Rome powerful was on display. The conquered peoples forced to fight. The criminals executed in elaborate spectacles. The animals from every corner of the empire killed for sport. And the gladiators. Always the gladiators. Marcus Nonius Macrinus was not born to this. The historical evidence suggests he was a free man who volunteered. This was not uncommon. The oath of the gladiator, the Sacramentum Gladiatorium, was available to anyone desperate or foolish enough to take it. Free men swore themselves into temporary slavery for a contract period, usually 5 years. In exchange, they received training, food, shelter, and a small payment. More importantly, they received the possibility of glory. This was the trap. The arena offered what Roman society otherwise denied to common men. Fame, recognition, the roar of the crowd, a chance to be seen by the emperor himself. For a poor man with no prospects, no family wealth, no connections, the ludus represented opportunity. You could die in the gutter unmourned, or you could die in the arena with your name on the lips of thousands. The choice seemed obvious. What the Lanisti never mentioned was that very few gladiators lived to complete their contracts. The promised freedom at the end of 5 years was technically available. In practice, it was fantasy. The actuarial tables were brutal. A gladiator fought, on average, 3 to 5 times per year. The mortality rate per fight varied, depending on the type of combat, but historians estimate it ranged from 10 to 20%. Simple mathematics reveals the truth. Over 5 years, fighting 15 to 25 times, the cumulative probability of death approached certainty. The gladiators knew this. They were not stupid, but hunger and desperation are powerful forces. And there was always the possibility that you would be different, that you would be skilled enough, lucky enough, beloved enough by the crowd to survive. This hope was not entirely false. Some did survive. Marcus Nonius Macrinus was apparently one of them. The fact that Marcus Aurelius honored him suggests he fought with distinction over many years. But for every Macrinus who walked out of the arena alive, hundreds died in obscurity. Their names are lost. The records did not preserve them. Why would they? Rome produced gladiators the way it produced pottery. In bulk. When one broke, you simply made another. The ludus where Macrinus trained was likely in Rome itself. Possibly the Ludus Magnus, the great school located directly next to the Colosseum. The building still exists in ruins. You can walk through it today. The training ground is visible, a rectangular space where men learn to kill and die. Around it are small cells, barely large enough for a man to lie down. These were not prison cells, though they functioned as such. Gladiators were technically allowed to leave the ludus during their free time. In practice, few did. Where would they go? They were marked men. The brand of the ludus was often burned into their skin. They belonged to their lanista as completely as any slave. The training was rigorous and surprisingly sophisticated. Gladiators were valuable property. Their owners invested heavily in their development. They ate better than Roman soldiers, a diet rich in protein and carbohydrates designed to build muscle and endurance. They received medical care from specialized physicians. Their trainers were often former gladiators themselves, men who had survived long enough to retire and now passed on their knowledge to the next generation. This care was not kindness. It was economics. A well-trained gladiator was worth significant money. He could be rented out for private shows, sold to another ludus, or wagered on in the endless betting that surrounded the games. His death in the arena was expensive for his owner. Therefore, he was trained to survive, but only to survive long enough to be profitable. The types of gladiators were strictly defined. The Murmillo fought with a large rectangular shield and a short sword, wore a helmet with a distinctive fish crest. The Thraex carried a small square shield and a curved sword. The Retiarius, the most unusual, fought with a net and trident. No helmet, minimal armor. Each type had traditional opponents. Murmillo fought Thraex. Retiarius fought Secutor. These pairings were not arbitrary. They were designed to create visual variety and tactical interest. They were also designed to ensure that someone died. The matches were not fair fights in any modern sense. The armor and weapons were deliberately mismatched to create dramatic tension. The Retiarius had range and mobility, but no protection. The Secutor had heavy armor, but limited vision through his enclosed helmet. The combat was real, but it was also theater. The crowd wanted to see skill, courage, and ultimately death. The gladiators provided all three. Marcus Nonius Macrinus's specific fighting style is not recorded. We do not know if he fought as a Murmillo or a Thraex or in one of the other, less common categories. We know only that he fought, and that he survived long enough to earn the emperor's attention. This was extraordinary. Marcus Aurelius was not known for his love of the games. Unlike his predecessors, particularly Commodus, who would later become obsessed with personally fighting in the arena, Marcus Aurelius viewed the games as a necessary but distasteful duty. He attended because the emperor was expected to attend. He presided over the slaughter with the same weary resignation he brought to every aspect of governance. His meditations contain several passages that seem to reference the games. He writes about the need to view all human activity, including violence, as part of the natural order. He reminds himself not to be disturbed by bloodshed, that death is simply the dissolution of elements that will recombine in new forms. These are not the thoughts of a man who enjoyed watching gladiators die. They're the thoughts of a man trying to justify what he knows is wrong. But he did not stop the games. He could not. They were too deeply woven into the fabric of Roman life. To abolish the games would have been political suicide. It would have enraged the mob, alienated the Senate, and undermined the religious foundations of the state. So Marcus Aurelius watched men kill each other and wrote about stoic acceptance and did nothing to change the system. This is perhaps the darkest aspect of the entire story. The best emperor Rome ever produced was still complicit in mass murder. The question that should trouble us is not why Rome had gladiatorial games. Many ancient societies practiced ritual violence. The question is why Rome expanded them, refined them, turned them into an industrial process. By the 2nd century AD, the games had metastasized into something beyond sport or religion. They had become a fundamental mechanism of imperial control. The formula was simple: provide bread and circuses, keep the population fed and entertained, and they will not revolt. This was not cynicism. It was practical governance. Rome had no standing police force, no effective way to control its massive urban population. The city of Rome itself housed close to 1 million people, packed into insulae, apartment buildings that were fire hazards and disease incubators. The potential for riot was constant. The games released that pressure. They channeled aggression and bloodlust into controlled spectacle. When you had just watched criminals torn apart by lions and gladiators fight to the death, your own grievances seemed smaller. Your own life, however miserable, seemed more secure. At least you were not in the arena. This was the unspoken bargain at the heart of Roman society. Submit to imperial authority, and you will be fed and entertained. Rebel, and you will become part of the entertainment. The criminals executed in the arena were not just punished. They were transformed into object lessons. Their deaths were elaborate, often involving reenactments of mythological scenes. A man condemned for theft might be burned alive while dressed as Hercules. A woman convicted of sacrilege might be raped by a giraffe in a grotesque parody of Pasiphae, coupling with the bull. These were not punishments in any legal sense. They were performances designed to horrify and titillate in equal measure. The message was clear. The emperor could do anything to anyone. There were no limits to imperial power, not even the limits of human decency or imagination. And the gladiators, even the successful ones like Marcus Nonius Macrinus, existed within this system. They were not rebels or resistors. They were participants. Every time they entered the arena and fought well, they validated the games. They made the spectacle more compelling. They gave the crowd something to cheer for. This is what the film Gladiator could not show. The real gladiators were not freedom fighters. They were collaborators in their own oppression. The oath they swore made this explicit. The Sacramentum Gladiatorium required the gladiator to pledge his body to his lanista, to accept burning, binding, beating, and death by the sword. The language was deliberately extreme. It was meant to strip away any illusion of dignity or autonomy. When you took the oath, you were declaring yourself already dead. Everything that followed was borrowed time. Some gladiators tried to escape. The historical record contains references to runaways, though details are scarce. The most famous example is Spartacus, who led a massive slave revolt in 73 BC. But Spartacus was an anomaly. Most escaped gladiators were quickly recaptured. The brand on their skin marked them. The specialized training they had received made them conspicuous. Where could a man go when everyone recognized what he was? Those recaptured faced punishment that made death in the arena seem merciful. The lanista had the right to torture his property however he wished. Escaped gladiators were often crucified as a warning to others, or they were sent into the arena with no armor, no weapons, forced to fight at impossible odds. This was called damnatio ad gladium, condemnation to the sword. It was execution dressed as sport. The system was designed to eliminate hope. You could not run. You could not refuse to FI. Refusal meant execution, but slow execution, degrading execution, execution that would strip you of even the small dignity that came from dying well in combat. So you fought, and if you were skilled and lucky, you survived another day, and another, until eventually your luck ran out. Marcus Nonius Macrinus somehow navigated this impossible landscape. We know from inscriptions that he received a golden crown from Marcus Aurelius, a significant honor. We know he may have been granted his freedom, though the evidence is ambiguous. Some historians believe he later became a provincial governor, which would be extraordinary for a former gladiator. Others are skeptical, suggesting the inscriptions may refer to a different Marcus Nonius Macrinus entirely. The ambiguity is telling. Even when a gladiator achieved something remarkable, the historical record barely noticed. The Romans were meticulous record keepers for matters of state and property, but gladiators existed in a liminal space. They were technically free men who had voluntarily enslaved themselves, or they were slaves who could theoretically earn freedom. They were celebrities who had no legal rights. They were heroes who were buried in mass graves with no markers. This contradiction was central to how Rome functioned. The gladiator was simultaneously elevated and debased. The crowd loved him while he lived and forgot him the moment he died. He was proof that even a slave could achieve glory, and also proof that glory meant nothing without freedom. The training for this glory was brutal beyond modern comprehension. Gladiators practiced with wooden weapons against wooden posts called paulus. They learned to make economical movements, to conserve energy, to strike with precision rather than power. They were taught that flashy moves were for actors. In the arena, survival depended on efficiency, but they were also taught to perform. The crowd demanded spectacle. A quick, clean kill was unsatisfying. The gladiators had to make the combat interesting. They had to show courage and skill. They had to, when wounded, display the proper stoicism. They had to, when defeated, accept death with dignity. This final requirement was perhaps the most important. How a gladiator died mattered more than how he lived. If he showed fear or begged for mercy, he shamed himself and his ludus. If he died well, presenting his throat to the sword without flinching, he earned respect and possibly a proper burial. The gesture was codified. The defeated gladiator would kneel, remove his helmet if he still wore one, and indicate his surrender. The decision to kill or spare him belonged to the editor, the sponsor of the games, though the crowds will usually influence the verdict. The pollice verso, the turning of the thumb, is famous from paintings and films. But historians debate what the actual gesture was. Thumb up, thumb down, thumb pressed against closed fingers, all have been proposed as the signal for death. What is certain is that the crowd made its preference known. They shouted and waved their handkerchiefs for mercy, or they screamed for death. The noise in the amphitheater was deafening. The editor, seated in his box, would gauge the mood and make his decision. If the verdict was death, the victor would approach his defeated opponent. The killing stroke had to be precise, a thrust to the throat or through the armpit into the heart. The defeated man was expected to remain still to make the execution easier. This was considered the height of courage. After the killing, attendants dressed as Charon, the ferryman of the dead, would enter the arena. They would strike the corpse with a hammer to ensure death. Then the body would be dragged away through the Porta Libidinensis, the gate of death. In the underground chambers, the corpse would be stripped of any valuable armor or equipment. Then it would be disposed of, burned, or buried in a mass grave with other gladiators. This was the fate awaiting every man who entered the arena. Eventually, Marcus Nonius Macrinus may have avoided it through exceptional skill or extraordinary luck, but he would have seen it happen to his training partners, his friends, the men he ate with and sparred with in the ludus. He would have watched them die and known that their fate was his fate, merely postponed. The psychological toll is unrecorded. Roman writers did not care about the inner lives of gladiators. We have no letters, no diaries, no first-hand accounts of what it felt like to live under the constant shadow of violent death. We have only indirect evidence: graffiti from gladiatorial barracks, epitaphs on tombstones, references in poetry and satire. What these fragments reveal is a strange culture within the ludus. The gladiators formed bonds, almost familial relationships. They called each other brothers. They mourned their dead with genuine grief. But they also bet on fights, including fights in which their friends would die. They seduced wealthy Roman women who were fascinated by their dangerous glamour. They drank and fought and fucked with the intensity of men who knew they had no future. This was not cognitive dissonance. It was adaptation. When death is certain and imminent, the human mind recalibrates. Things that would seem monstrous in normal life become ordinary. You learn to compartmentalize. You develop dark humor. You find pleasure where you can, because tomorrow you might be the one bleeding out in the sand. The women who pursued gladiators are particularly interesting. Roman moralists condemned these affairs as shameful, but they could not stop them. Aristocratic women, married to respectable senators and equestrians, took gladiators as lovers. Some even ran away with them, abandoning wealth and status for a man who might be dead within months. This was not romance. It was transgression. The gladiator represented everything Roman society officially despised: violence, slavery, physical excess. But he also represented everything Roman society secretly craved: freedom from social convention, direct expression of power, the body as weapon and instrument of will. By sleeping with a gladiator, a noble woman was slumming in the most extreme way possible. She was degrading herself, which was precisely the point. In a society where women had almost no control over their lives, where they were passed from father to husband like property, the affair with a gladiator was an act of rebellion. Of course, the gladiator had no real power in these arrangements. He was still property. If his lanista discovered the affair, he could be punished or killed. The woman risked scandal and divorce, but the gladiator risked everything. The relationship was not equal. It could not be. But in a world where genuine equality was impossible, perhaps inequality that violated social norms was its own kind of freedom. Marcus Nonius Macrinus may have experienced these complications. If he was as successful as the historical record suggests, he would have attracted attention. Women would have offered themselves. Wealthy men would have invited him to dinner parties, the way modern celebrities are invited to galas. He would have been simultaneously celebrated and degraded, proof of Roman meritocracy and Roman corruption in one scarred, muscular body. The scars were important. Gladiators wore their wounds visibly. In a culture that valued physical perfection, the gladiator's scarred flesh was both badge of honor and mark of shame. It proved his courage and his degradation. Every scar was a story, but also a brand identifying him as someone who had been owned, used, nearly destroyed. The armor they wore was designed to minimize scarring on visible parts of the body while maximizing the visual impact of the combat. A Murmillo's helmet covered his entire head and face, but his torso and limbs were largely exposed. The Retiarius wore no helmet at all, fighting with his face visible to the crowd. This was deliberate. The audience needed to see suffering. They needed to see the fear and pain in the gladiator's eyes. This is difficult for modern people to understand. We watch violence in films and television, but it is clearly artificial. We know the blood is corn syrup. We know the actors will get up and go home. Roman audiences had no such buffer. The violence was real. The blood was real. The screaming was real. And they loved it. Not everyone. There were critics, philosophers who condemned the games as barbaric. Seneca wrote a famous letter describing his horror at attending the midday executions, when criminals were forced to kill each other in clumsy, unskilled combat. He describes it as murder, plain and simple. But Seneca's criticism was unusual. Most Romans saw nothing wrong with the games. They were normal, expected, part of life. This normalization is perhaps the most disturbing aspect. The games were not aberrations. They were the system working as designed. Children grew up attending. They learned to cheer for their favorite gladiators, to imitate their moves and play. The games were woven into festivals and holidays. They marked important occasions. When an emperor died, games were held. When a general triumphed, games were held. When a wealthy patron wanted to increase his political standing, he sponsored games. The scale was staggering. The Colosseum, completed in 80 AD, could hold 50,000 spectators. It was not the only amphitheater in Rome. Smaller venues dotted the city and every major town in the empire. Conservative estimates suggest that tens of thousands of gladiators died in the arenas over the centuries Rome maintained the games. Some historians put the number much higher, possibly in the hundreds of thousands. Each one was a person. Each one had trained and bled and hoped to survive. Each one died in front of a cheering crowd that forgot him before his body was cold. The logistics of this slaughter were complex. The gladiators had to be trained, fed, housed, and equipped. The amphitheaters had to be built and maintained. The wild animals for the hunts had to be captured, transported, and kept alive until their moment in the arena. This required a vast infrastructure. The ludus was part of a larger machine that existed solely to produce violent spectacle. The lanisti who owned the gladiators were businessmen. Some were wealthy and respectable. Others were considered barely better than pimps, profiting from human misery. All of them understood that their product was suffering. They bought slaves or signed contracts with free volunteers, transformed them into fighters, and rented them out to die. The contracts with free volunteers were particularly simple. The lanista promised payment, training, and the possibility of freedom. What he delivered was a life expectancy measured in months and burial in an unmarked grave. But the contract was legal. The volunteer had signed willingly. If he died, that was his own fault for being insufficiently skilled. This logic extended to the slaves who fought. Many gladiators were prisoners of war, captured in Rome's endless military campaigns. They had no choice in their fate. But Roman legal thinking held that a slave was already dead in a civil sense. He had no legal existence. Therefore, anything done to him was not really done to a person. It was done to property. This allowed Romans to commit atrocities without cognitive dissonance. The gladiator was not fully human. Therefore, his suffering did not fully matter. He could be trained with brutal methods, starved if he underperformed, tortured if he tried to escape, and killed for entertainment. None of this violated Roman morality, because Roman morality was predicated on a hierarchy of human value. Citizens were fully human. Free non-citizens were somewhat human. Slaves were barely human. And gladiators, even those who had been free, occupied the lowest rung. They had chosen degradation. They had sold themselves. They deserved what they got. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, never challenged this logic. He could have. He had absolute power. But his philosophy, Stoicism, emphasized acceptance of the world as it was. Change the things you can control, accept the things you cannot. The games were beyond his control, not because he lacked power, but because they were too fundamental to Roman identity. To abolish them would have required reimagining what Rome was. And that was unthinkable. So the games continued, year after year, generation after generation. The machinery of death operated with industrial efficiency, and men like Marcus Nonius Macrinus fed themselves into it, hoping to be the exception, the survivor, the one who walked out free. So did walk out. The rudus was a wooden sword given to gladiators who had earned their freedom. To receive the rudus was to be released from the oath, to become legally free again. It was the dream that sustained every gladiator through the horror of the arena. But freedom was not what it seemed. A free gladiator was still scarred, still marked by his past. He had no trade except violence. He had spent years in the ludus, disconnected from normal society. Where could he go? What could he do? Many free gladiators continued to fight, voluntarily re-entering the arena even after receiving the rudus. The Lanisti encouraged this. A veteran gladiator was valuable, and if he chose to FI, the crowd loved him even more. This raises a disturbing question. Was it really choice? When your only marketable skill is killing and you have no other means of survival, is choosing to fight actually voluntary? Or is it the illusion of choice, coercion dressed up as free will? Rome never asked this question. Neither did Marcus Aurelius. They both benefited too much from the answer remaining unclear. The emperor's relationship with Marcus Nonius Macrinus is documented in fragments. An inscription mentions the golden crown. Another suggests honors and gifts. The exact nature of their interaction is lost. Did they speak? Did Marcus Aurelius watch Macrinus fight and see something that moved him? Did he recognize in this scarred, violent man some quality worth preserving? Or did he simply follow protocol, honoring a successful gladiator because that is what emperors did? The historical record cannot tell us. We are left with gaps, silences, the vast space between documented facts where actual human experience occurred. This is the frustration of studying gladiators. They lived in the center of Roman society, performing before thousands, yet they left almost no trace of their inner lives. What we can reconstruct is the structure of their existence, the rhythms of the ludus. Training in the morning, rest in the afternoon, meals taken communally. The nervous energy before a fight, knowing that some of the men eating with you would be dead within days. The strange camaraderie that developed, bonds formed in the knowledge of shared doom. And the fights themselves. The walk from the ludus to the amphitheater, through streets lined with crowds. The wait in the underground chambers, listening to the roar above, the clash of weapons, the screams. The moment of entering the arena, the sudden shock of sunlight and noise. The face of your opponent, a man you might have trained with, a man who wants to kill you not from hatred, but from necessity. The fight was not like Hollywood depicts. Real combat is brief and vicious. Most fights lasted only minutes. The goal was to wound your opponent enough that he could no longer effectively resist, then finish him. Or, if the crowd and editors showed mercy, to accept his surrender and spare him for another day. But mercy was not guaranteed. The crowd was fickle. They might love you after one FI and demand your death after the next. The editor might need to curry favor with the mob, and denying them blood was politically dangerous. So even when you won, even when your opponent surrendered, you might still be required to kill him. This is what separated the arena from the battlefield. In war, killing the enemy served strategic purpose. In the arena, killing served no purpose except spectacle. The man you were killing was not your enemy. He was your colleague, your competitor, possibly your friend. But Rome demanded his death, so you provided it. The psychological weight of this is incomprehensible. How do you remain sane when your job is to murder people who have done nothing to you? How do you sleep after driving a sword through a man's throat while he knelt helplessly before you? The gladiators found ways. They developed rituals, superstitions, mental frameworks that allowed them to continue. They told themselves that death in the arena was honorable, that the gods looked favorably on those who died with courage, that there was glory in the struggle, even if the struggle ended in slaughter. These were lies, but necessary lies. Without them, the only alternative was despair. Some gladiators did despair. Suicide was not uncommon. The historical record contains references to gladiators who killed themselves rather than fight. One famous story, possibly apocryphal, describes a German prisoner who choked himself to death by shoving a sponge down his throat. Another account mentions a gladiator who deliberately impaled himself on his opponent's weapon rather than continue living. These were acts of rebellion disguised as acts of surrender. By choosing death on their own terms, these men reclaimed the one thing Rome had taken from them: agency over their own bodies. But suicide was risky. If you failed, the punishment was severe. And if you succeeded, you were considered coward. Your name would be forgotten, your memory dishonored. So most gladiators chose to fight, to play the game Rome had designed for them, and to hope that somehow they would be the ones to survive. Marcus Nonius Macrinus apparently chose to fight and to survive. The evidence suggests he was extraordinarily skilled. Skill alone was not enough. Luck played a crucial role. A moment of inattention from your opponent, a slip in the sand at the critical instant, the crowd's mood shifting in your favor. These things were beyond control, but they determined who lived and who died. The training attempted to maximize skill and minimize the role of luck. Gladiators practiced for hours every day. They developed muscle memory, reflexes faster than conscious thought. They learned to read their opponent's body language, to anticipate attacks, to exploit tiny openings in defense. They also learned their own limitations. A gladiator had to know when to conserve energy and when to expend it. He had to know how much blood he could lose before losing consciousness. He had to know the difference between a wound that would kill him and a wound he could fight through. This knowledge was acquired through experience, which meant through injury. Every gladiator bore scars from training accidents and real fights. Some lost eyes, some lost fingers, some developed chronic pain from broken bones that healed poorly. These injuries were part of the job. You accepted them or you quit, and quitting meant death. The medical care available was surprisingly advanced. Roman physicians had extensive experience with trauma surgery, learned from treating soldiers. They could stitch wounds, set bones, even perform amputations. The gladiatorial physicians were specialists in keeping damaged men functional. But their goal was not healing in any complete sense. It was maintenance. They patched you up enough to fight again. If an injury was too severe, if you could no longer perform, you were disposed of. A crippled gladiator had no value. He might be sold to a mine or a quarry, where he would die slowly instead of quickly, or he might simply be killed. This calculus extended to everything in the ludus. Every decision was economic. Food was provided based on your value as a fighter. Training was intensive for those who showed promise, perfunctory for those who did not. Medical care was allocated according to your potential return on investment. You were not a person. You were inventory. This dehumanization was necessary for the system to function. If the Lanisti thought of their gladiators as fully human, they could not send them to their deaths. If the crowd thought of them as fully human, they could not cheer their slaughter. If the emperors thought of them as fully human, they could not continue the games. So everyone agreed on the fiction that gladiators were somehow different, lesser, deserving of their fate because they had chosen it, even when the choice was between the arena and starvation. Marcus Aurelius himself wrote about this in his Meditations. He discusses the importance of recognizing the common humanity in all people. But he does not extend this recognition to gladiators. They appear in his writings only as examples of how to face death with courage. They are objects, not subjects, props in philosophical arguments, not people with their own inner lives. This blindness was not unique to Marcus Aurelius. It was universal in Roman society. Even critics of the games, like Seneca, did not see gladiators as fully human. Seneca objected to the games because they coarsened the audience, not because they murdered the participants. The gladiators themselves were almost beside the point. This is what makes the history so dark. It is not just that terrible things happened. It is that terrible things happened and almost no one noticed or cared. The machinery of death operated in plain sight, documented in administrative records and celebration in poetry, and it was considered normal. The games reached their peak in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. Hundreds of amphitheaters dotted the empire. Every major city had one. Some were massive, rivaling the Colosseum in size. Others were smaller, local venues, but all served the same function. They provided space for sanctioned violence, a place where the contradictions of Roman society could could be enacted and resolved through ritual death. The symbolism was complex. The arena was a microcosm of the empire itself. Conquered peoples fought each other, demonstrating Roman dominance. Wild animals from Africa and Asia were slaughtered, proving Rome's reach. Criminals were executed in elaborate displays, showing the price of disobedience. And gladiators, the lowest of the low, fought for the pleasure of the highest, the emperor himself. Every death in the arena reinforced the social order. It reminded slaves that they could be killed at will. It reminded free men that freedom was conditional. It reminded everyone that Rome was eternal and all-powerful, and that resistance was futile. But the games also provided a release valve. They allowed the population to vicariously experience violence without actually committing it. You could scream for blood and watch men die, and then go home feeling purged, cleansed of your aggressive impulses. This was the genius of a system. It channeled destructive energy into structured spectacle. Of course, this energy had to be constantly renewed. You could not show the same executions and fights year after year. The crowd would grow bored, so the games had to escalate. More gladiators, more exotic animals, more elaborate methods of execution. Under Trajan, in the early 2nd century, games were held that lasted 123 days and involved 10,000 gladiators. Under Commodus, Marcus Aurelius' son, the emperor himself entered the arena and fought, though against carefully selected opponents who were ordered not to harm him. The spectacle was not enough. It had to be constantly intensified. This escalation had a dark logic. Each innovation made the previous level of violence seem tame. What shocked one generation became routine for the next. The threshold for what qualified as entertaining death crept steadily upward. Eventually, simple combat between two gladiators was not enough. You needed mass battles, naval reenactments in flooded arenas, elaborate theatrical productions where the deaths were real. The audience became desensitized. This is predictable. Repeated exposure to violence reduces emotional response. The Romans knew this. They responded by increasing the violence. But there's a limit to how much violence even a desensitized audience can absorb. Eventually, the games began to lose their power to shock and entertain. This did not happen quickly. The games continued for centuries after Marcus Aurelius. But cracks began to appear. Christian writers condemned the games as pagan barbarism. Economic pressures made the massive spectacles harder to afford. The empire itself began to fragment, and resources that once funded entertainment were diverted to defense. The last recorded gladiatorial games were held in the early 5th century AD. By then, Rome was a shadow of its former self. The barbarians were not outside the gates. They were inside, ruling. The Western Empire was collapsing. And in this collapse, the games finally died. But they died not because Rome recognized their evil. They died because Rome could no longer afford them. The moral awakening came later, imposed by Christianity and rewritten in histories that pretended Rome had always been uncomfortable with the games. This was false. Rome loved the games. It mourned their loss. And gladiators like Marcus Nonius Macrinus were forgotten, remembered only in fragmentary inscriptions that recorded honors without context. We do not know how many men he killed. We do not know how he felt about it. We do not know if he believed the lies Rome told about glory and honor, or if he recognized the system for what it was and fought anyway because there was no alternative. The silence is total, and in that silence, we can hear the echo of thousands of other gladiators whose names we will never know, whose stories were never written, who died in the sand and were buried in mass graves and left no trace except the collective memory of violence that defined an empire. Rome did not weep for its gladiators. It used them and discarded them and forgot them. And when we try to understand this history, we are confronted with the unsettling realization that cruelty on this scale requires not monsters, but ordinary people making ordinary decisions within a system that defines cruelty as normal. The question we cannot escape is whether our own systems are fundamentally different or merely less visible. But this is getting ahead of the story. We must return to Marcus Nonius Macrinus, to the man himself, to the fragments of his life that survive in stone and document. We must try to reconstruct not just what he did, but what it meant to do it, in a world where violence was currency and death was entertainment. We must understand how an empire built on conquest and slavery created a culture that celebrated suffering, and how that culture produced men who volunteered to be part of it. We must understand the ludus. The gladiatorial schools were more than training facilities. They were total institutions in the sociological sense. Every aspect of a gladiator's life was controlled. When he woke, what he ate, how he trained when he rested. Privacy did not exist. The cells where gladiators slept were small, barely furnished. Some ludus had communal sleeping areas. Others provided individual cells, but the doors could not be locked from inside. This was deliberate. The lanista needed complete access to his property. Gladiators could not be allowed to barricade themselves, to refuse orders to hide. They lived in a state of permanent surveillance. The food was better than what most Roman poor ate, but it was functional rather than pleasurable. Barley porridge, beans, dried fruit, some meat. The diet was designed to build muscle and endurance. Gladiators were sometimes called hordearii, barley men, because they consumed so much of the grain. The food was sufficient but monotonous. Some gladiators received better rations as rewards for victories. Others were put on reduced rations as punishment for poor performance or disciplinary infractions. Food was leverage, another tool of control. Water was carefully rationed. Dehydration reduced performance, so gladiators were kept adequately hydrated. But luxury was not permitted. You drank water, sometimes diluted wine. Nothing more. The day began early. Training started at dawn, while the air was still cool. The gladiators would be roused from their cells and assembled in the training ground. The doctors, the trainers, would lead them through exercises. Conditioning first, running, jumping, wrestling. Then weapons training with the paulus, the wooden post. The paulus was heavier than a real sword, deliberately so. Training with excess weight made the actual weapon feel lighter during combat. Gladiators would strike the post thousands of times, drilling specific moves until they became automatic. Thrust to the throat, slash to the leg, block and counter. The movements were practiced in isolation first, then combined into sequences. After individual drills came sparring. Gladiators fought each other with wooden weapons and protective gear. These practice bouts were serious. Injuries were common, but they were necessary. You could not learn to fight by hitting a post. You needed to face another person, someone trying to hurt you, someone whose movements were unpredictable. The doctors watched carefully. They noted who showed talent, who struggled, who was improving, who had reached his ceiling. This information was valuable. It determined who fought whom in the arena, who was worth investing more training in, who should be sold or discarded. The trainers themselves were usually former gladiators. They had survived their time in the arena and now passed on their knowledge. Some were kind, within the constraints of their role. Others were brutal. All of them understood that they were training men to die. This created a strange dynamic. The doctor had a vested interest in his student's success. A well-trained gladiator reflected well on his school, but he also knew that most of his students would not survive. He had to maintain emotional distance while providing effective instruction. Some doctors managed this by focusing entirely on technique. They did not allow themselves to see their students as people. There were projects, problems to be solved, raw material to be shaped. This dehumanization was self-protective. You could not mourn every student who died. You would go mad. Other trainers try to maintain some humanity. They learned their students' names, encouraged them, tried to instill not just skill, but confidence. These doctors often burned out. The emotional cost of caring for men who would almost certainly die was unsustainable. Marcus Nonius Macrinus would have been shaped by this system. We do not know who trained him, but whoever was imparted skills that kept him alive through multiple FIs. This suggests either exceptional natural talent or exceptional training, or, most likely, both. Natural talent in a gladiator meant several things. Physical attributes: strength, speed, endurance, coordination. Mental attributes: courage, tactical thinking, ability to remain calm under extreme stress. And psychological attributes: capacity to compartmentalize, to kill without hesitation, to accept the possibility of death without being paralyzed by fear. Not everyone possessed these qualities. Many men who entered the ludus discovered they lacked what was necessary. They were too slow, or too weak, or too frightened. These men usually died quickly. The first fight culled the inadequate. Those who survived the first fight often survived several more, because they had proven they had at least the minimum necessary qualities. But even talented gladiators needed luck. An injury at the wrong moment, an opponent who was slightly better, equipment failure, bad footing in the sand. Any of these could be fatal. So survival required talent, training, and luck in roughly equal measure. Marcus Nonius Macrinus apparently had all three. The fact that Marcus Aurelius honored him suggests he fought many times and won consistently. This was rare enough to be noteworthy. But what did winning mean? In the immediate sense, it meant you lived another day. In the broader sense, it meant you moved closer to potential freedom. Every victory increased your value. A successful gladiator could hope for better treatment, special privileges, possibly the rudis. These incentives kept gladiators fighting even when rational calculation suggested they should refuse. The chance of freedom, however small, was better than certain death from refusing to fight. So they entered the arena again and again, hoping that this time would be the last time, that victory would bring release. It never did, or almost never. The system was designed to keep successful gladiators fighting. They were too valuable to free. The lanista would promise freedom, dangle it as motivation, but always find reasons to delay. One more fight, one more season, one more year. This exploitation was legal. The contract bound the gladiator for a set term, but the terms could be extended or renegotiated, usually not in the gladiator's favor. A gladiator who objected could be reminded that refusal meant punishment or death. So they continued fighting, caught in a trap where success only ensured continued exploitation. The psychology of this situation is devastating. Hope sustained the gladiator through the horror, but hope was also the mechanism of his oppression. If he had no hope, he might rebel or refuse. But with hope, he cooperated in his own destruction. Rome understood this dynamic perfectly. The entire system of Roman slavery operated on the same principle. Dangle freedom as a possibility, make it theoretically achievable, then ensure that it almost never actually happens. This way, slaves remain motivated without the expense of constant coercion. Gladiators were the most visible example of this mechanism. Their potential freedom was celebrated, mythologized. Stories circulated of gladiators who won the rudis and retired in glory. These stories were mostly propaganda. The reality was death in the sand, burial in a mass grave, oblivion. But the propaganda was effective. It convinced free men to volunteer. It convinced gladiators to keep fighting. It convinced the crowd that the games were not simply slaughter, but a legitimate path to honor and freedom. This lie was necessary for the games to continue. If everyone acknowledged that the games were just murder for entertainment, they would become morally untenable even by Roman standards. But if they were a test of virtue, a chance for even slaves to achieve glory, then they were acceptable, even admirable. Marcus Aurelius participated in this lie. When he honored Marcus Nonius Macrinus, he was validating the entire system. He was saying, see, the games are just. Skill and courage are rewarded. Even a gladiator can earn imperial favor. The fact that thousands of other gladiators died unrewarded and unmourned was irrelevant. The exceptional case proved the rule. The system worked because, look, here is a gladiator the emperor honored. Never mind the mass graves. Never mind the blood. Never mind the systematic destruction of human life for no purpose except spectacle. This is the irreversible moment we must understand. Not a single decision, but the cumulative weight of thousands of decisions each one rational within its own frame of reference, that together created a machine of death. The lanista deciding to buy a slave, the trainer teaching a strike to the throat, the emperor attending the games, the crowd cheering, the gladiator stepping into the arena. None of these individual actions was extraordinary. Collectively, they produced horror, and once the system was established, it was almost impossible to stop. The ludus needed gladiators to stay profitable. The gladiators needed the ludus for survival. The crowd expected the games. The emperors needed to provide them. Canceling the games would have been economically, politically, and religiously catastrophic. So the games continued, decade after decade, century after century. An entire civilization organized around ritual violence, and no one with the power to stop it could imagine doing so. Marcus Aurelius could have stopped it. He was emperor. His word was law, but he did not, because stopping the games would have required him to declare that Rome itself was wrong, that the foundation of Roman identity was rotten, and that was unthinkable. Instead, he watched men die. He wrote in his journal about accepting fate, and he gave golden crowns to gladiators who survived, as if this honor meant anything against the backdrop of mass slaughter. The crown given to Marcus Nonius Macrinus was probably a corona aurea, a gold wreath. These were prestigious awards, usually given to military officers for exceptional valor. For a gladiator to receive one was highly unusual. It suggests that Macrinus did something remarkable, fought with such skill or courage that even the emperor noticed. We do not know what he did. The specifics are lost, but we can imagine. Perhaps he fought against impossible odds and won. Perhaps he displayed exceptional mercy to a defeated opponent. Perhaps he simply fought so many times and won so consistently that his cumulative achievement demanded recognition. Whatever the reason, the crown was meaningless in any material sense. It did not free him. It did not protect him from future fights. It was symbolic only, a gesture from the emperor that changed nothing about the fundamental reality of Macrinus's existence. He was still a gladiator. He still lived in the ludus. He still faced the arena. The crown was a beautiful lie, and Rome was built on beautiful lies. The truth was uglier. The truth was that Rome needed the games because Rome was fundamentally violent and unstable and held together only through the constant application of force. The games channeled that force into entertainment. They made violence tolerable by making it spectacular. Without the games, the violence would have had to find other outlets. Civil war, riots, revolution. The games prevented these things by providing a substitute. Instead of killing each other, Romans could watch professionals do it. Instead of tearing the empire apart, they could tear apart criminals and gladiators. This was the unspoken bargain. Submit to authority, and you can watch others suffer. Rebel, and you become the suffering. The choice was clear. Gladiators occupied a unique position in this system. They were simultaneously victims and enforcers. They suffered, but their suffering made the crowd complacent. They died, but their death prevented larger deaths. They were human sacrifices in a society that officially no longer practiced human sacrifice. Except they did. The executions in the arena were human sacrifice. The gladiatorial combats were human sacrifice. Rome had simply redefined sacrifice as entertainment, wrapping ancient bloodlust in the language of justice and sport. The religious dimension was never fully erased. The games were still held during religious festivals. They still honored the dead. The blood still fed the gods, even if Romans no longer explicitly said so. The form had changed, but the function remained. Ritual violence to appease supernatural forces and maintain cosmic order. This is why the games were so hard to abolish. They were not just entertainment. They were fundamental to how Romans understood their relationship with the divine. To stop the games was to risk angering the gods, to invite disaster. Better to keep killing gladiators than to gamble with divine wrath. Christianity eventually provided an alternative framework. The Christian God did not require blood sacrifice. He had provided his own on the cross. Therefore, gladiatorial combat was unnecessary and wrong. This argument gained traction slowly, over centuries. But it did gain traction, and eventually the games ended. But not in Marcus Aurelius's time. In his time, the gods still demanded blood, and gladiators provided it. Marcus Nonius Macrinus provided it. How many times, we do not know. How many men died on his sword, we cannot say. The number might have been small, if he was skilled at forcing surrenders. Or it might have been substantial, if the editors he fought for preferred death to mercy. Either way, he was a killer. This is inescapable. Whatever his virtues, whatever his skills, whatever honors he received, he killed men for the entertainment of crowds. This was his job. He did it well enough to survive and prosper. We should not romanticize this. The film Gladiator presents its protagonist as a hero forced into the arena against his will, fighting for justice and vengeance. This is fantasy. Real gladiators fought because they had no alternative, and they killed because refusal meant their own death. There was no heroism, only survival. Marcus Nonius Macrinus was not a hero. He was a man caught in a system that destroyed almost everyone it touched, and he happened to be skilled and lucky enough to avoid destruction. That is all. The fact that he avoided destruction is itself morally ambiguous. Survival in the arena meant killing others. Every time Macrinus won, another gladiator lost. Every time he walked out alive, someone else was dragged out dead. His success was built on other men's failure. This zero-sum arithmetic defined the entire system. Gladiators were not teammates working toward a common goal. They were competitors in a death sport. Your success was your opponent's annihilation. There was no way to win without someone else losing everything. This created a peculiar social environment in the ludus. Gladiators trained together, ate together, lived together. They formed bonds, but they also knew they might have to kill each other. Trust was conditional. Friendship was provisional. Any man who treated you with kindness today might drive a sword through your liver tomorrow. How do you maintain sanity in such an environment? Some gladiators managed by refusing to form attachments. They remained isolated, focused solely on their own survival. Others formed temporary alliances, knowing these would dissolve the moment they stepped into the arena together. Still others simply accepted the contradiction, loving their brothers and preparing to kill them with equal sincerity. The human capacity for compartmentalization is remarkable. We can hold contradictory beliefs and emotions simultaneously, switching between them as needed. Gladiators became experts in this. In the ludus, you were brothers. In the arena, you were enemies. Both were true. Both had to be true, or the psychological weight would be unbearable. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this kind of cognitive flexibility in his Meditations. He discusses the importance of adapting to circumstances, of accepting what cannot be changed. But he applies this wisdom to himself, to his own struggles with imperial duty. He does not extend it to the gladiators. They remain abstract examples, not real people grappling with impossible contradictions. This blindness was typical. Romans could be remarkably sophisticated in their thinking about some topics and remarkably obtuse about others. The same person who wrote eloquently about universal human dignity could watch gladiators die without seeing the contradiction. Part of this was simple desensitization. If you grow up watching violent spectacle, it becomes normal. You do not see it as wrong any more than you see eating meat as wrong. It is just how things are. But part of it was also motivated reasoning. Romans benefited from the games. They provided entertainment, released social tension, demonstrated imperial power. Acknowledging that the games were wrong would have required giving them up, and no one wanted to do that. So they constructed elaborate justifications. The gladiators were criminals, therefore they deserved death. Except many were not criminals. They were prisoners of war, or slaves, or free volunteers. The gladiators had chosen this fate, therefore they had consented. Except consent under duress is not really consent. The gladiators died with honor, therefore their deaths had meaning. Except honor is not a substitute for life. Every justification collapsed under scrutiny. But the justifications were not meant to withstand scrutiny. They were meant to allow Romans to continue enjoying the games without feeling guilty. This is how atrocity becomes normalized. You do not need evil people. You just need ordinary people who want to enjoy themselves and who are willing to ignore the cost of that enjoyment. You need a system that makes atrocity profitable or entertaining or religiously necessary. And you need enough people to go along with it that resistance becomes impossible. Rome had all of these elements. The games were profitable for Lanisti, entertaining for the crowd, religiously sanctioned by tradition, and politically necessary for emperors. Anyone who objected could be dismissed as naive or weak or un-Roman. The few voices of criticism, like Seneca, were easily ignored. They were philosophers, impractical dreamers who did not understand how the real world worked. Their objections could be noted and then set aside. The games would continue, and they did continue, through Marcus Aurelius's reign, through the chaos that followed, through the 3rd century crisis, all the way into the 5th century, when the empire itself collapsed and the games finally died, not from moral awakening, but from sheer lack of resources. This is perhaps the most damning fact. Rome did not choose to end the games. The games ended because Rome ended. Given the choice, Romans would have kept killing gladiators forever. Marcus Nonius Macrinus lived in the middle of this long horror. He was not at the beginning, when the games were new and still shocking. He was not at the end, when decay had set in and the spectacles were shadows of their former grandeur. He lived in the High Empire, when the games were at their peak, when the Colosseum was new and the supply of gladiators seemed inexhaustible. This was the worst possible time to be a gladiator. The system was fully developed, ruthlessly efficient, and culturally normalized. There was no prospect of reform, no emerging criticism that might eventually lead to abolition. Just the endless grind of training and fighting and watching your friends die and knowing your turn was coming. That Macrinus survived, this is remarkable. That he was honored by the emperor is extraordinary. But these facts should not obscure the larger reality. Thousands died for everyone who survived. The mass graves were full of men who were just as skilled, just as brave, just as determined as Macrinus. They simply got unlucky. Luck is not a satisfying explanation. We want to believe that success is earned, that skill and virtue are rewarded. But in the arena, the correlation between merit and survival was weak. Good gladiators died all the time. Bad gladiators occasionally survived through pure chance. This randomness was terrifying. It meant that no amount of training or courage or skill could guarantee survival. You could do everything right and still die because your opponent got lucky or you slipped in the sand or the editor was in a bad mood. The gladiators developed superstitions to cope with this. They worshipped specific gods, performed rituals before fights, wore lucky charms. These practices gave them a sense of control in a situation where they had almost none. If you performed the ritual correctly, maybe the gods would protect you. If you wore your lucky charm, maybe you would survive. Of course, the rituals did not work. The charms did not protect. The gods, if they existed, did not intervene. Gladiators died regardless of how carefully they observed the superstitions. But the superstitions persisted because they were psychologically necessary. Without them, you had to confront the raw terror of pure randomness, the knowledge that you might die for no reason at all. Better to believe in lucky charms and divine favor, even if you suspected they were lies. This is another way the system maintained itself. It did not just use physical force. It used psychological manipulation. It gave gladiators just enough hope to keep fighting, just enough sense of control to prevent despair, just enough chance of success to make resistance seem pointless. And it worked. Gladiators kept fighting, decade after decade, generation after generation. They could have refused en masse. They could have rebelled, but they did not because the system was designed to prevent exactly that. Spartacus was the exception, and his revolt was crushed with spectacular brutality. 6,000 of his followers were crucified along the Appian Way, their bodies left to rot as a warning. The message was clear: resist and you will suffer. Comply and you might survive. Most gladiators chose compliance. It was the rational choice, even if it was also the choice that ensured the system's continuation. Marcus Nonius Macrinus chose compliance. He fought when ordered to fight. He killed when ordered to kill. He accepted honors when they were offered. He played his role in the machine. We should not judge him too harshly for this. What else could he have done? Individual resistance would have been suicide. Collective resistance required organization that was impossible in the ludus, where gladiators were deliberately kept isolated and dependent. He did what he had to do to survive. That is all anyone can do in an impossible situation. But we should also not celebrate his survival as triumph. It was not. It was complicity. Every time he stepped into the arena and fought, he validated the system. He made it work. He was part of the machine, even if he was also a victim of it. This ambiguity is uncomfortable. We want clear moral categories, heroes and villains, victims and oppressors. But the arena offered no such clarity. The gladiators were victims and enforcers simultaneously. They suffered and they inflicted suffering. They were exploited and they were complicit. This is true of most systems of oppression. The victims are often forced to participate in their own oppression. The slave overseer is himself enslaved. The prisoner guard is himself imprisoned in a different sense. The collaborator collaborates because refusal means death. Understanding this does not excuse anything, but it complicates the moral arithmetic. It forces us to recognize that evil is not just what monsters do. It is what ordinary people do when placed in systems that demand evil as the price of survival. Rome was such a system, and the gladiatorial games were its purest expression. A machine that took men, used them, destroyed them, and discarded them, all while presenting this process as entertainment and honor and religious necessity. Marcus Aurelius knew this. He was too intelligent not to know, but he did nothing to stop it, because stopping it would have required admitting that Rome itself was rotten at its core. And that admission would have undermined everything he believed about duty, virtue, and a natural order. So he watched men die. He gave out golden crowns. He wrote in his journal about acceptance and fate. And the machine kept running. The aftermath of each fight was its own kind of horror. The winner would be led from the arena, exhausted, wounded, covered in blood. Some of the blood was his own. Some belonged to the man he had just killed. In the chaos of combat, the two had mixed, becoming indistinguishable. In the underground chambers, attendants would clean him. Cold water to wash away the blood. Wine to dull the pain. Bandages for the wounds. If injuries were serious, a physician would be summoned. The physician would assess the damage with clinical detachment. Can this man fight again? How soon? What interventions are necessary to restore functionality? The gladiator would sit or lie on a table while his body was evaluated as equipment. No one would ask how he felt about killing another human being. No one would offer psychological care. The inner wounds were irrelevant. Only the outer wounds mattered, and only insofar as they affected future performance. If the physician determined that recovery would take too long or that the gladiator was permanently diminished, arrangements would be made to dispose of him. Not kill him necessarily, though that was an option. More likely, sell him to someone who needed unskilled labor. Mines, quarries, agricultural estates, places where damaged men could still be profitable, even if only marginally. This was the final degradation. To survive the arena only to be sold to die slowly in a mine shaft, breathing stone dust until your lungs failed. Some gladiators preferred to die in combat. At least it was quick. Meanwhile, the dead man was being processed through a different channel. His body had been dragged from the arena through the Porta Libidinensis. In the spoliarium, the stripping room, his armor and equipment were removed and cataloged. Anything valuable was cleaned and repaired for reuse. Anything damaged beyond repair was discarded. The body itself was worthless. It might be burned, ashes scattered without ceremony. It might be buried in a mass grave with other gladiators. No marker to indicate who they had been. Occasionally, if the gladiator had been popular or well-regarded, his ludus might pay for a proper burial and a modest tombstone. These tombstones survive. They are our primary source of information about individual gladiators. The inscriptions are terse. Name, fighting style, number of victories, age at death. Sometimes a brief epitaph. He fought well, or beloved by his brothers, or mourned by his wife. These fragments of stone are all that remains of lives lived in the shadow of constant death. They tell us that gladiators had names, that some had families, that they were mourned. But they tell us almost nothing about the interior experience of being a gladiator. The fear, the guilt, the desperate hope, the grinding horror of it all. The silence is total. We can infer, but we cannot know. What we know is that the system continued. After Marcus Nonius Macrinus fought and survived and was honored, other men entered the arena. After those men died or survived, more followed. The supply seemed endless. The empire was vast. There were always more prisoners, more slaves, more desperate free men willing to sign the contract. The Lanisti prospered. The crowds were entertained. The emperors maintained their power. And the gladiators died, one after another, year after year, until the sheer accumulation of corpses should have choked the arena. But it did not. The machine was too efficient. The bodies were removed too quickly. The next batch of fighters entered before the blood from the previous batch had dried. This efficiency is what allowed the horror to continue. If bodies had been left to rot in the arena, if the crowd had been forced to confront the cumulative weight of death, they might have balked. But the corpses were whisked away. The sand was raked clean. Fresh gladiators entered. And the spectacle continued as if nothing had happened. Out of sight, out of mind. This is how systematic atrocity functions. The killing is segregated, made invisible to those who do not have to witness it directly. The beneficiaries of the system, the crowd enjoying the entertainment, are insulated from the reality of what they are enjoying. They see the fight. They do not see the aftermath. They see the victory. They do not see the disposal of the corpse. They experience the spectacle as clean, dramatic, even beautiful in its way. The ugliness is hidden. This was deliberate. The Romans were sophisticated in their understanding of spectacle. They knew that too much reality would be off-putting. So they choreographed the violence carefully. The entrances were dramatic. The combat was skilled. The deaths were relatively quick. And the cleanup was invisible. The result was entertainment that felt victimless, even though the victims were right there in the arena, bleeding and dying. The psychological distance between crowd and gladiator was maintained through careful staging. You were not watching real people suffer. You were watching a performance. This distinction was crucial. It allowed the crowd to enjoy the spectacle without guilt. The gladiators were actors playing a role. When they died, they were simply exiting the stage. Tomorrow there would be new actors and new performance. Except the deaths were real. The blood was real. The suffering was real. But the framing was so effective that the crowd could ignore this. They could cheer and place bets and argue about technique, all while men died in front of them. This cognitive dissonance is not unique to Rome. We see in our own society. We enjoy products made by exploited labor, eat food produced through animal suffering, benefit from systems that harm others, all while maintaining the belief that we are good people. The psychological mechanisms are the same. Distance, abstraction, selective attention. Rome simply applied these mechanisms to violence in a more direct way. They turned suffering into sport. And they did it so effectively that even philosophers like Marcus Aurelius could participate without feeling the weight of what they were doing. The weight existed, though. It had to. You cannot participate in systematic violence without being changed by it. Even if you do not consciously acknowledge the damage, it accumulates. For the gladiators, this accumulation was obvious. The physical scars were visible. The psychological scars were not, but they were certainly there. You cannot kill men repeatedly without being traumatized. You cannot live under the constant threat of death without developing coping mechanisms that distort your psyche. Modern soldiers return from war with PTSD. Ancient gladiators had no such diagnosis, no framework for understanding what was happening to them. But the symptoms would have been the same. Hypervigilance, emotional numbing, flashbacks, difficulty trusting others, substance abuse. The gladiators drank. This is well documented. Wine was part of their ration, and many consumed far more than what was provided. They sought oblivion temporary escape from the knowledge of what they had done and what awaited them. Some turned to religion with unusual fervor. The cults of Mithras and other mystery religions were popular among gladiators. These cults offered the promise of rebirth, of salvation, of meaning beyond the arena. They provided community and ritual and the hope that death was not the end. Whether this hope was justified is unknowable, but it was psychologically necessary. Without it, the only alternative was despair. And some did despair. The suicide rate among gladiators was likely high, though the sources do not provide statistics. We have anecdotal evidence of men who killed themselves rather than continue. We have philosophical discussions of whether such suicide was cowardly or courageous. But we do not have systematic data. What we have is the knowledge that the system continued. Despite the trauma, despite the horror, despite everything, gladiators kept fighting. The machine kept running. And Rome kept watching. Marcus Nonius Macrinus was part of this. He fought, he survived, he was honored. But he was also complicit. He made the machine work. Without gladiators willing to fight, the games could not continue. Every gladiator who entered the arena, for whatever reason, validated the system. This is the darkest truth. The victims were necessary participants. Their courage, their skill, their determination to survive, all of it fed the machine. The only way to stop the machine was to refuse to participate. But refusal meant death, so almost no one refused. The few who did refuse are remembered as cowards. Gladiators who would not fight were despised, their names forgotten. Gladiators who fought well were celebrated, even honored by emperors. The incentive structure was clear, and so the killing continued. Fight after fight, year after year. An empire built on blood, sustained by blood, entertained by blood. And at the center of it all, the arena, where the blood was shed most visibly, most publicly, most systematically. We return now to where we began. The man in the arena, chest heaving, sword arm trembling. The defeated opponent in the dirt. The crowd roaring. The emperor watching. This moment has happened thousands of times. It will happen thousands more. It is not special. It is routine. Just another day in a machine. But for the man standing there, it is everything. This moment is his entire world. The noise, the blood, the exhaustion, the knowledge that he has survived but will have to do this again and again, until eventually he does not survive. Marcus Nonius Macrinus stood in this moment multiple times. Each time he walked out alive, he was beating the odds. Each time he walked out alive, he was ensuring he would have to walk back in. The golden crown from the emperor was recognition of this impossible achievement. You have defied death repeatedly. You have made us proud. You have justified our faith in the games. But the crown was also a chain. It bound him more tightly to the arena. How could he stop fighting now after being honored? How could he refuse to give the crowd more of what they wanted? He was successful, which meant he was valuable, which meant he was trapped. This is the final irony. Success in the arena did not lead to freedom. It led to more fighting. The better you were, the more fights you were required to give. Your skill condemned you, unless you were exceptional enough to be freed. Unless the emperor or your lanista decided that you had earned the ludus. This happened sometimes. We have evidence of it, but it was rare enough to be noteworthy, which means it was rare enough to be effectively meaningless as a realistic prospect. For every gladiator who was freed, hundreds died, still enslaved. The freed gladiators were propaganda, proof that the system worked, that freedom was achievable. The dead gladiators were invisible, forgotten, erased. This is what Rome refused to acknowledge. The games were not a path to glory. They were mass murder dressed up as sport. The few who survived did not validate the system. They were the exceptions that proved how lethal the rule was. Marcus Aurelius could have acknowledged this. He could have looked at the arena, truly looked at it, and recognized it for what it was. A mechanism for destroying human life, for no purpose except the pleasure of the crowd. But he did not. He gave out golden crowns and wrote about stoic acceptance and did nothing to change the fundamental reality. The gladiators kept dying. The crowds kept cheering. The empire kept turning. And when Marcus Aurelius died in 180 AD, the games did not die with him. They continued under his son Commodus, who loved them even more. They continued through the 3rd century crisis, through the Christianization of the empire, all the way to the 5th century. Centuries of blood, hundreds of thousands of lives, an entire civilization organized around ritual violence. And no one stopped it until the civilization itself collapsed. This is the true horror. Not that it happened, but that it happened for so long, with so little resistance, with so little recognition that something was fundamentally wrong. The Romans were not monsters. They were people. They loved their children, wrote poetry, built aqueducts, created law codes. They were capable of great beauty and great cruelty, often simultaneously. The gladiatorial games were not an aberration. They were an expression of what Roman civilization actually was, beneath the marble and the rhetoric and the philosophy. They revealed the truth, that Rome was built on violence and could only be sustained through violence. The violence had to be constant. It had to be visible. It had to be normalized. Otherwise, the empire would have eaten itself. The games channeled the violence outward, away from the ruling class, into the bodies of those who had no power to resist. This is how empire functions. It requires a class of people whose suffering maintains the system. Slaves, gladiators, conquered peoples, the poor. Someone has to pay the cost. As long as that someone is not you, you can enjoy the benefits and ignore the screams. Marcus Nonius Macrinus was one of the people who paid the cost. He survived, which makes his story unusual. But survival is not vindication. He should not have been in the arena in the first place. No one should have been in the arena. The fact that he fought well, that he was honored, that he possibly earned freedom, none of this changes the fundamental wrong. He was used. He was exploited. He was forced to kill for entertainment. His survival does not make this acceptable. And yet, his survival is all we know about him. The rest is silence. The inner man, his thoughts and feelings and dreams, all of it is lost. We have a few inscriptions, a golden crown mentioned in passing, and nothing else. This is what Rome did to its gladiators. It used them until they died or stopped being useful, then forgot them. Their names might be inscribed on stone, but their actual lives, the texture of their experience, the weight of what they endured, all of it vanished. We try to recover these lives through archaeology and careful reading of sources. We try to imagine what it felt like to live in the ludus, to fight in the arena, to kill and fear being killed. But we are always imagining. We are always inferring from insufficient evidence. The truth is we will never know what Marcus Nonius Macrinus felt. We will never know if he believed in the system or hated it. We will never know if the golden crown meant something to him or if he recognized it as the empty gesture it was. We know only that he existed, that he fought, that he survived long enough to be noticed, and then he disappeared from the historical record as completely as if he had never been. This disappearance is its own kind of death. To be forgotten is to be erased. And Rome forgot its gladiators with ruthless efficiency. They served their purpose and were discarded, individually and collectively. The games themselves are remembered. The Colosseum still stands. We know the names of famous gladiators like Spartacus. But the vast majority, the thousands who died unmourned and unmarked, they are gone. Their suffering is lost. This is the final injustice. Not just that they were killed, but that they were killed and forgotten. That their deaths meant nothing, changed nothing, taught nothing. That Rome watched them die and learned only that spectacle sells, that violence entertains, that human life is cheap when the supply is abundant. We should have learned better. We should have looked at the arena and recognized it as a warning. This is what happens when violence is normalized. This is what happens when entertainment becomes more important than human dignity. This is what happens when power is allowed to operate without moral constraint. But we did not learn. We built our own arenas, our own systems of exploitation and violence. The forms changed, but the function remained. Use people, discard people, forget people. Rome fell. The gladiatorial games ended. But the mechanisms that made them possible, the willingness to ignore suffering for convenience or profit or entertainment, those mechanisms are still with us. We are not so different from the Romans. We are not more moral, just more squeamish about seeing the violence directly. We prefer our atrocities at a distance, mediated through abstractions and euphemisms. But the blood is still real. The suffering is still real. The victims are still real, even when we cannot see them. Marcus Nonius Macrinus was real. He lived. He fought. He survived, somehow, against impossible odds. And then he was forgotten, buried under centuries of other violence, other cruelty, other systems that chewed up human lives and spit them out. This is his monument, not a golden crown, not an honor from an emperor, but this attempt to remember, to acknowledge, to recognize that he existed and that his existence mattered, even if Rome did not think so. He deserved better. They all deserve better. Every man who died in the arena, every slave who was killed for entertainment, every person who was sacrificed on the altar of Roman glory. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve to have their stories told. They deserve justice. They received none of these things. Rome used them and discarded them and moved on. And the world moved on. And the forgetting continued, year after year, century after century, until the gladiators became mythical figures, disconnected from the actual horror they endured. This documentary cannot restore what was lost, but it can insist on remembering. It can insist that the golden crowns and the philosophical meditations do not erase the blood in the sand. It can insist that survival is not vindication and that honor is not a substitute for justice. Marcus Nonius Macrinus survived the arena, but he should not have had to. The arena should not have existed. The games should not have been allowed to continue for centuries. Rome should have recognized its own cruelty and stopped. It did not. And this failure, this willing blindness, this systematic destruction of human life for entertainment, this is what we must remember. Not the glory of Rome, not the wisdom of Marcus Aurelius, not the courage of the gladiators, but the machine, the endless, grinding machine that consumed human beings and called it sport, that turned murder into entertainment and suffering into spectacle, that operated in plain sight, documented in stone and celebrated in verse, while philosophers wrote about virtue and emperors gave out golden crowns. That machine existed. It was real. It destroyed countless lives. And understanding how it worked, how it was maintained, how ordinary people participated in it without recognizing its horror, this understanding is necessary. Because the machine never really stopped. It just changed forms. And if we do not remember what it looked like in Rome, we will not recognize it when it appears again, in our own time, wearing a different mask but serving the same function. This is why we remember Marcus Nonius Macrinus. Not because he was special, but because he was ordinary. One gladiator among thousands. One victim among countless others. One life used and almost forgotten. Almost, but not quite. Because we have these fragments, these inscriptions, this evidence that he existed. And from these fragments, we can reconstruct not the man himself, but the system that created him, used him, and tried to forget him. That system was Rome, the eternal city built on blood, sustained by violence, finally brought down not by moral awakening, but by its own internal contradictions and external pressures. The gladiators died. The games ended. Rome fell, but the memory remains. Incomplete, fragmentary, insufficient, but present. And in that presence, there's a kind of justice. Not the justice of punishment or restoration, but the justice of remembering, of refusing to let the forgetting be complete. Marcus Nonius Macrinus existed. He fought in the arena. He survived. He was honored by the emperor. And then he disappeared into the silence of history, along with all the others who died in the sand. This is their monument. These words, this insistence on remembering what Rome wanted forgotten. The machine existed. It destroyed lives. And we remember so that we might recognize it if it appears again in whatever form it takes. This is all we can do. Remember, bear witness. Refuse to let the dead be forgotten completely. It is not enough. It will never be enough. but it is what we have. The arena is empty now. The crowds are gone. The gladiators are dead. The emperor is dust, but the blood soaked into the sand. And the sand remembers, even if we forget. We will not forget. This is our oath. Not to the lanista, not to the emperor, not to the crowd, but to the dead, the forgotten, the used and discarded. We remember you. We bear witness to your suffering. We insist that you existed, that you mattered, that the horror inflicted upon you is wrong. This is all we can offer, but we offer it in memory of Marcus Nonius Macrinus, in memory of all the gladiators whose names are lost, in memory of every person who died in the arena, across the centuries, across the empire, across the vast machinery of Roman violence. You existed. You suffered. You are not forgotten. Not completely. Not yet. Never completely. Never entirely. We remember. This is Warpath Warriors. Thank you for listening. The blood in the sand has dried, but the memory remains. Until next